My general thought is that they should have let them go in the opposite order. I was more impressed by what we heard from Denard Wilson, but that is also a result of the fact that Nick Holtz, as he so aptly put it, I'm just like a regular offensive coordinator. I just don't call the plays. So he's kind of put in a weird position because it's a different job title. What were your takeaways, Sam, from what we heard yesterday from those two fellows?
Yeah, well, first of all, are we embarrassed? Are we calling this an embarrassing moment? I thought it was just kind of hilarious.
I'm not embarrassed. I would have been embarrassed if I was involved. I think it was embarrassing for the individuals involved personally, because I think we should be able to be adults and take turns.
That's we don't have to talk about it too much, but I thought that was funny. Like, I'm seeing
it was funny.
Like, oh, how embarrassed. I'm like, I thought it was kind of hilarious. Like, I mean, I enjoyed myself. I was kind of sipping my tea in the corner.
It was the highlight of my day. Yeah, no, I agree.
As far as the press conference is concerned, I do think you are correct that not having them in the reverse order, potentially a mistake, where you just kind of leave the press conference with a weird taste in your mouth of like, okay, I guess this is your offensive coordinator. Right. That's kind of been my feelings from the jump here regarding Nick Holtz, is that he is severely underqualified to be an offensive coordinator. I think the worst hire that Brian Callahan has made thus far. But at the end of the day, like, nothing matters if Brian Callahan is the right guy. I mean, Brian Callahan's the offensive coordinator and the head coach and in control of the quarterback more than anybody else on this coaching staff. And so my biggest takeaway offensively was, as long as Will Levis develops and you have the right head coach, all of these other pieces will fall in line. Like, you can say Nick Holtz is a great offensive coordinator hire if he makes Brian Callahan better at his job, because Brian Callahan will then make the quarterback better at his job. And that is ultimately what we are here for. I, like you, was impressed with Denard Wilson. I appreciated the kind of energy and I think direction that I got from him with his defense. Like, I didn't get this energy from Denard Wilson that he's just a vibes guy and is like, oh, we're going to go and play physical. I think he has a plan, right? I think there was a clear, definitive plan for the type of defense Denard Wilson wants to run, the things he wants to prioritize, very thoughtful and intentional. And then I would say as well, I'm refreshed by the idea that, and I didn't actually notice this in real time. I had to go back and read the transcript. I was so caught up in his General George Patton quote, talking about trying to attack, that I missed the part where he says, the ball moves faster in the air than it does on the ground, so we need to play good pass defense. And I was just like, wow, finally a defensive staff that doesn't talk about stop the run, stop the run, stop the run, but also, why are we not creating more turnovers as our quarterbacks get burnt over the top?
If we can't get to the quarterback, we're screwed. Well, no, you could play coverage is also an option.
So I did appreciate that. And I think he just conducts himself in a way that gives me a lot of confidence in what he's capable of doing with this defense. Offensively, meh. All right. Hopefully Brian Callahan's good. Like,
Denard had a couple of gems in there. And I didn't know this until afterwards. I think the General George Patton quote is funny because he's Canadian. I didn't know this. So it's funny that he's quoting some American icons. He had a couple of gems in there, like when he mentioned he wanted the Titans to have obnoxious communication. I like that one. JT, do you have any idea what the perception of Brian Callahan was when he was in this role that Nick Holtz is in, brought in to Taylor's staff early on? Like, was he also just kind of like a scapegoat guy when things went poor? I'm saying also, I'm kind of assuming that we're going to have the awesome experience of whenever things don't go right, it's going to be Nick Holtz's fault. When things do go right, it's going to be Brian Callahan's fault. Was that the experience in Cincinnati?
See, I think people actually put more of the blame on Zach Taylor because they questioned how he would call the plays sometimes. I feel like in the kind of in the Cincinnati media space, it was a lot of, well, like, obviously I think Brian Callahan does get some blame, but at the same time, you kind of have to look at the results on the field. And that's where you see, oh, Zach Taylor is the one calling the plays. That's where you directly see results either happen or not. So I feel like it actually was the inverse of that. And I think it's kind of like what we saw yesterday, as Brian Callahan was kind of just for at least the start of his tenure there in Cincinnati was kind of just a guy. Like, and that's kind of how it felt yesterday in the press conference. Is like Nick Holtz is just a guy who is there to help him along the way and help him develop. But ultimately, results come down to the guy who is calling the plays. And if it's successful, I think like we could maybe tear back the layers if there truly is, when we get into the next season, kind of this idea that things continually are not working week after week. But on a game-to-game basis, I think the results are going to be, does Brian Callahan call the correct plays and are they working or not? And I think that is something that we'll see early on. But if it continues to be a growing issue, then maybe we'll have some questions about if Nick Holtz in what they're doing together is the problem.
Well, sorry to jump in.
No, go ahead.
But I think Nick Holtz is, that might be the best way of describing it, is just a guy. And so I guess while we're doing like this, podcast for dummies so that people kind of like, we dispel some narratives when we're talking about it, let's get ahead of the narrative you mentioned, Easton, that nothing that goes wrong with the Titans offense in 2024 is Nick Holtz's fault. I'm going to say that straight up.
And nothing that goes well is necessarily to his credit.
Correct.
Like he just,
I found it interesting that a head coach and a defensive coordinator and a coaching staff overall, even the owner of the team, has talked at length about, let's get some difference of opinion. Let's get some different ideas in here. And yet when asked about how his ideas have differed from Brian Callahan's, Nick Holtz's response is, actually, I feel like we're really like-minded. Like I haven't offered anything unique or new at all. I'm just here to kind of do what I'm told. And so I've had this conversation with Austin Stanley of AtoZSports a few times since the Nick Holtz hire happened. But what exactly is the analogy for Nick Holtz as the offensive coordinator? What is his job, right? Because you could
what
say,
exactly is it that you do here?
You could say he's the sous chef to the chef. But then you think about it and I say, well, a head chef does Brian Callahan's job. They create the menu. They create the dishes. They draw up what everything is going to taste like, be presented like, how the evening is going to go. But on game day, the head chef has to go and delegate different responsibilities around the kitchen. And it's more on the sous chef to execute that sort of thing. So while Brian Callahan is doing his head coaching duties, Nick Holtz needs to oversee the offense. But if a sous chef messes up on game day, things go really poorly for a restaurant. And I don't think Nick Holtz can mess up at a level that it like affects the Titans offense. So I don't know if he has sous chef power. Austin suggested to me, perhaps he's the nanny and he's watching the kids while the parents are away. And I say, but a nanny can really mess up a kid if you don't have the right one. And so we've kind of gone on this, what is the analogy for Nick Holtz? And maybe it is what JT said, and he's just a guy. So to kind of put a bow on that, the question that you need to ask as a Titans fan or as Titans media throughout this season is not, is Nick Holtz the problem, but is the lack of input from offensive coordinator what you are giving up by having Nick Holtz as your offensive coordinator? Is that a problem? Not that he is inherently dragging things down, but when you look at maybe who is, a great quarterbacks coach or offensive mind or somebody out there that we could bring in to give us some new ideas that we don't have on our staff because we have Brian Callahan's high school buddy on the staff, does that impact the organization enough where you have to move on from him? That would be the question I'm going to be keeping an eye out for.
Jake says Nick Holtz is a lizard person sent here to be a scapegoat in 2024. He may very well be. The sous chef analogy, I think, is interesting. It's not going to be like in The Bear where like the sous chef sets up the online thing and then there's 10,000 tickets. Like he's not going to be able to mess up game day like that. I agree with, like, that's what I was driving home yesterday from the press conference thinking most about, because I was trying to think about, well, okay, yes, it seems like in this position, he's kind of just a guy and he's not going to be able to really do anything positively or negatively for himself. And yet Brian Callahan was in the same role in Cincinnati and he got himself a head coaching job in a relatively short period of time. So what's the difference? And I was thinking about Brian Callahan and what his role was in Cincinnati, and the thing that he differentiated himself for those of us when he was a candidate, right? We're talking about what are his qualifications, what separates him from the pack. It was, okay, he's the quarterback guy, right? Like, look at this resume of quarterbacks he's worked with. Clearly he's got, high regards from a lot of these guys that he's worked with, and they're recommending him. And it sounds like he's kind of that QB guru kind of guy. And I'm wondering if Holtz is maybe going to eventually carve out for himself a path like that, a lane like that. But ultimately, Sam, if I had to guess today, I think it's like all the evidence points to, okay, these guys were buddies on the coaching staff at a very low level. It seems like from what we heard at the press conference, we're in lockstep on a lot of things. He might just be the messenger, man. Like he may may really just be the guy. Brian Callahan might be thinking, I hired this guy because he's going to agree with me and I trust him to communicate my message to the team when I can't, so that I can do other things. And so he's literally just going to be my mouthpiece to allow this organization to have two me's, which may or may not be a good thing, but that's my best guess as to how it looks, at least early on.
And I think real quick, right, what you're saying right there, two me's, I think that's kind of the similar thing I came away with. Can Nick Holtz be a force multiplier to what Brian Callahan wants to do with this offense? And I think that's kind of how the Titans are now set up. Just real quick on the defensive side of the ball, with Jannard Wilson, can he, Chris Harris and Steve Jackson be a force multiplier to turn this secondary around? And I think that's what I got away from Jannard Wilson, that man, with these three guys in the room, I think they can really have a chance to turn things around. Can Nick Holtz not turn this around, but be a force multiplier to Brian Callahan's ideas and how he wants to run this offense and take it to an even next step above what Brian Callahan wants to do? And I think that's that is the top goal of what Nick Holtz can do. But ultimately, I think where we might end up is like what you're saying, is that he is simply just the messenger.
And the end result, kind of like you said, Easton, is Nick Holtz being an extra Brian Callahan is fine and dandy as long as Brian Callahan
doesn't suck.
Who he needs to be,
yeah, exactly.
Right. But there is a difference between who Nick Holtz is with the Titans and who Brian Callahan was with the Bengals. And I think it comes down to the resume before getting hired as the offensive coordinator, where, Brian Callahan established himself as the quarterback guy, but he was a quarterback guy before he was an offensive coordinator. He was Matthew Stafford's OC. He was Matthew Stafford's QB coach. He was a QB coach for Peyton Manning at one point in time. Like, he popped around Derek Carr, I think, at one point as well.
Tim Tebow, hello.
Hey, hello. He was a guy who had worked with quarterbacks. And so him transitioning into a role with the Bengals that he connected with Joe Burrow, with Andy Dalton at one period in time, or even with Jake Browning most recently, not a huge shocker. And that is where ultimately my concern stems from with Nick Holtz, or I guess my indifference stems from with Nick Holtz, is
good word.
You've never been a quarterback coach. You've never even been a position coach. At best, he was an assistant position coach at the NFL level, was a relatively unsuccessful college offensive coordinator. And so I have doubts about his ability to develop into that quarterback guy that has a specialty on the Titans staff.